Hi, I'm David Plazas. I'm the Opinion and Engagement Director for the USA Today Network Tennessee and the Tennessean. I have the privilege and honor of having as my guest today Congressman Jim Cooper, who, after a long distinguished career in the House of Representatives, is retiring. Congressman Cooper, how are you doing today?
Doing great, David. Always wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. You know, one of the things that I have to review about a little bit is that when I had to meet you for the first time, your staff made me do some homework on you. And we ended up having a conversation, though it was fascinating, we ended up having a conversation about The System, the book by Roeder and Haynes, about your role in the first attempt to create a massive healthcare reform. And I want to bring you back, because this was during your first stint in Congress. Could you talk about a little bit about that time? You know, you were the youngest member of Congress when you were first elected, and how you compare that first stint with the most recent 20-year stint in District 5.
Well, thank you, David. Healthcare reform has always been super important to me. Everyone needs healthcare, usually sooner than they think. And Tennessee is kind of a backward state that way, because our people are not healthier than people in other states. Now, Nashville is an exception. We're called a healthcare capital, but that's mainly due to a lot of the companies that make money off of providing healthcare. But the net result is not a healthier population. So there's a disconnect here. How do you solve that problem? One way is through universal coverage, allowing everyone to have health insurance. And that's been the most frustrating thing about Congress, because we finally got universal health care passed at the federal level, the ACA, Obamacare. But Tennessee has refused. It's one of 12 states to refuse to accept Obamacare. So as a result, we still have hundreds of thousands of Tennesseans who are left out without any health insurance. We're turning down $1 billion a year in free federal aid that could enable all of our people to get the health care that they deserve. So that's been a central frustration. And that was largely in my first time in Congress, because I was on the health care committee then. In my second time in Congress, I was not even allowed to apply to be on the health care committee. They viewed me as too much of a force in that field. And, you know, I've taught at Vanderbilt Business School for 20 years, so I actually know what I'm talking about. But the second stint in Congress has been largely on the defense and intelligence committees. Those are also super important, but they're a little bit less involved in the daily lives of most Tennesseans, unless they're veterans or active duty service people.
You know, one of the things that you made me think about right now is that in the election of November, South Dakota voted to expand Medicaid. It became, I believe, the 39th state to do so. One of the noted entrepreneurs in town, Michael Bertram, just wrote a guest opinion column saying if South Dakota can do it, why can't Tennessee? And we've seen it in other states as well. And what is going on? Why do you think it'll ever happen in Tennessee?
Well, universal health care is very popular with people, of course, because everyone wants that benefit. So I hope it will be allowed to be voted on in Tennessee. It would certainly pass. But see, our legislature filters out that popular sentiment because of their resentment for Obama and for Obamacare and for their just general anger. They think that health care should not be available to everyone. I mean, I think it's a basic human right. It may be a God-given right, because you don't have much chance for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if you're not healthy enough to enjoy those things.
As we talk right now, next year we've seen reports about the fact that more than 300,000 people might be kicked off the TennCare rolls precisely because the COVID emergency is coming to an end. My research and our reporting has shown that people have gotten sicker through COVID in terms of disabilities. We already knew that we had 1 in 3 Tennesseans with a disability, and that was pre-COVID, and we've also had long COVID issues. What would be your recommendation for how to address this really urgent need for getting people healthcare access?
Well, it would be tragic for Tennessee to be even worse in providing health insurance coverage to our people. Our state right now is relatively prosperous, even though we're about the lowest tax state in America. We've been given a tremendous amount of money by the federal government. In fact, more money than the state has asked for, more money than the state has shown the capability of using. The Conservative Beacon Foundation several years ago discovered that Tennessee had stockpiled more money that it refused to spend, $760 million in that case, money designated for poor people, but our Tennessee officials refused to spend it. So it's embarrassing to be in a state that intentionally does less to help its people than any other state. But those are the folks who are in charge of state government right now. and they kind of enjoy that sort of lack of concern toward all of our citizens, all of our people.
So I want to turn to your first term in office. You were 25 years old when you were elected. What do you know today that you didn't know then that has helped inform you and helped you grow?
Well, David, I was probably one of those people who was like born old, because I was always an excellent student. I always tried to behave properly. In law school, my nickname was the Reasonable Man, and that didn't help me get a lot of dates or anything like that. But even my classmates said, well, Cooper will do the right thing. He'll do the fair thing. So what I tried to do first is listen, because it's amazing where good ideas come from. You don't have to have credentials. You don't have to be fancy to have good ideas. You just have to think about what the problem is and make an accurate diagnosis. Then once you have the accurate diagnosis, the treatment options are pretty obvious. But so many people like to fight about diagnosis, like to dispute diagnoses, and that's just a waste of time. We need to collect the evidence. We, above all, need to focus on the truth and the evidence, and then slowly and carefully make a rational decision about what should be done. So that's always been my approach. I've always also believed in bipartisanship, because no political party has a monopoly on wisdom. Both parties have some good ideas on occasion. Sometimes parties reverse roles. Like I was fortunate, even though my father had been governor of Tennessee and was a Democrat, the party that in the 1950s was best on civil rights and women's rights and environment was the Republican Party. And then 20, 30 years later, that shifted and Democrats became the best on those issues. So there's nothing that's static about politics in America. You have to pay attention all the time.
You've served in Congress through 7 presidencies, from Reagan all the way to the current Biden presidency. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship that you think Congress had with the president, and whether Congress has been able to be effective over these last 40 years or so?
Some presidents have clearly been better than others. I'd say the 2 best were Reagan, because he was quite an inspirational leader. Even though, to be honest, he was largely out of touch. He was already suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's then, although the public did not know that. And Obama was just remarkably brilliant and talented, although he had to subdue a lot of his initiatives. Just in his role as the first black president in America, a lot of folks could only handle so much. But the main thing that's happened in that time is the degradation of Congress. And that started really when Newt Gingrich became Speaker. He centralized all the power on the top. He made the speakership hopelessly political. He also virtually eliminated committees in Congress, because committees today are told what to do. So the old-fashioned system of committee deliberations and coming up with a good bipartisan bill after a lot of hearings and work, that's thrown out the window by Newt Gingrich. And one of the tragedies was, and my main worry about Nancy Pelosi was, when she finally became Speaker, she largely copied the Newt Gingrich system, because the Speaker is still highly partisan. And the previous role model had been Tip O'Neill, who was a good, strong Democrat, but he believed that he was the Speaker of the whole House. He wanted Democrats to win, but he didn't insist on it. And his best friend was the Republican leader, Bob Michel. You know, they got along great, and they would also go have drinks at the White House with Reagan. You know, that's when things worked better together. And we need to find out a way to return to those days, and also allow committees to have real expertise again.
So I presume that Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy do not go over to drinks.
Oh my gosh. Kevin is one of the most partisan people to have ever served. He was turned down in 2015 by House Republicans in favor of Paul Ryan, who was a much more balanced and fair-minded person. But it looks like now Kevin is about the last person standing, although his election could be heavily contested right now. Several of his Republican colleagues, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad, are talking about rejecting him when the vote comes up on January 3rd.
Now, you mentioned being the reasonable man, and you have not been afraid to be contrary in Congress. You actually didn't vote for Nancy Pelosi for the first few times, and you tell me a little bit about that. What went through your mind as you were making those decisions? Because this could have potentially isolated you politically? And I don't know if it did, but
Well,
yeah.
a lot of folks have trouble understanding this, but Speaker Pelosi and I actually get along great. In fact, she gave me the highest honor she could give me 2 years ago, because everyone wants to be on the Intelligence Committee, but that year there were only 2 slots, and I got one of the 2 slots. So we have a great mutual respect, and see, for her political purposes in San Francisco, she needs to look liberal, and my opposition to her helped her look liberal. And also here in Tennessee, sometimes I need to look more conservative, and my opposition to Pelosi helped me look more conservative. So we helped each other with that. And it was kind of a mutually agreed upon, and I did not endanger her leadership, but I was able to express a different opinion, because these organizational issues are very important. The public doesn't see them, but the Newt Gingrich harm done to Congress should be reversed, and I wish that Democrats were more interested in reversing that harm.
If I recall correctly, you once voted for the late General Powell for Speaker.
Colin Powell, I voted him several times. Once I voted for my colleague Tim Ryan, because Colin Powell was a leading Republican with tremendous leadership skills, who was known for supporting Barack Obama. And that's really your main job in Congress, is to make sure that America is successful. And that oftentimes means that the president has to be successful. We can't be fighting each other, especially with foreign policy issues. Politics should stop at the water's edge. Americans need to be united abroad. That's the way we're the strongest nation on earth. But so often we want to fight, we want to grandstand, we want to bicker, and all that foolishness may make you famous on Fox TV, but it's not a good way to lead the country.
I was listening to the Axios podcast this morning, and they talked about that the first year of the Biden administration, people were basically saying this was the worst year ever for him, and now, a year later, there's a different story. Could you take us through these last 2 years of what happened?
Well, Joe Biden is a tremendous leader, and no president has ever been this well prepared. He understands bipartisanship. He's always gotten along. One of his best friends is actually Mitch McConnell. So he has worked very hard at that, building the personal relationships that you need to establish the trust so that you can pass major bills. Most every president since Reagan has tried to pass a major infrastructure bill, roads, bridges, highways, internet, things like that. And guess what? They all failed until Joe Biden. But see, our media cycles are so fast now. A lot of folks just kind of said, well, yeah, that's done, move on. Well, this is a huge accomplishment. And it was one of those things that Congress used to do easily, but in recent decades has become almost impossible. It's a little bit like immigration reform. We haven't had a good immigration bill since Ronald Reagan. But see, today, if we were to repass the Reagan bill, Republicans would call that amnesty, even though that was Ronald Reagan's bill. George W. Bush tried to get a bill passed, and both Reagan and Bush were governors of border states with Mexico. They understood immigration better than most folks. But there are folks in the Republican Party who want to preserve this as a political football, keep this as a reason so that we can fight each other or hate each other. And that's not only harmful to immigrants, it's also harmful to the American body politic, because we are a nation of immigrants. You know, unless you're Native American, we are all descended from somebody who came here. So it's a good example of an issue that's been so hopelessly demagogued. It's really harming the nation.
Tell me a little bit about your decision to announce your retirement, because I can't even imagine that, 20 years serving in District 5, you had another decade on District 4. And I know the political reasons for that, and you've talked about it quite a bit in the media. But in terms of that final list, could you take us through what was the last straw, and how are you approaching retirement? Because I can't imagine you being retired.
Well, you're very kind. And I'm planning on being super active. I want to teach. I want to be an investment banker. I'm completing a book right now. I didn't choose to retire. I was forced to retire by gerrymandering. And I predicted several years in advance, and we tried to alert everyone we could find, like, the Republicans are ready to chop up Nashville. They are ready to destroy the capital city of our state politically for their own personal gain. And so many people didn't believe me. They said, oh, they'll never do that. Well, we had an indication a year before it happened, because they passed a law saying that our local chancellor, Ellen Hobbs Lyle, would be deprived of jurisdiction in a case involving redistricting. So that cut off avenues for appeal. That clearly showed their fingerprints on the murder weapon. And yet that didn't persuade many folks who, and this is what's happened because Republicans listen primarily to corporations that have a lot of influence. I've worked particularly closely, or tried to, with the Nashville Chamber of Commerce, because so many wonderful corporations have moved to our area, and they choose to move to Nashville. They don't, you may have offices or people in these other locations, but Nashville is the draw. We're one of the most important cities in America now. We're certainly the hottest city. I am the envy of all my colleagues in America when I'm on the House floor, because they come up to me and say, what's Nashville's secret? You know, my family's moved there. My relatives have moved there. My folks have, we're just, so why would Republicans risk destroying that? Because today, basically, you have freedom of choice. If a company moves to Nashville, if you're a Democrat, you can live inside Davids County. If you're not a Democrat, you can live out in one of the wonderful ring counties. So you have choice. But today, you don't have a choice. You will be represented by a Republican congressperson. And that's not any choice at all. So it risks destroying the magic that we've had here. And many of these companies, guess what, simply would not have moved here if they knew that their federal representatives were going to be voting like this. We just had a vote yesterday. You know, none of the folks in the Tennessee delegation even supported gay marriage, even though that's become accepted by most everybody in America today, but not in Tennessee. So do we choose to be backward? Do we choose to be, you know, alienating to folks? Do we choose to be hostile? That's not the Tennessee way. Our way has always been hospitality and finding practical solutions that work for everyone.
Now, you mentioned the Tennessee way. I hear a lot of rhetoric from some of our senators about Tennessee values used, and I've written, so I've said this has been used as a cudgel to really be divisive. And how should citizens approach that? How would you recommend other members of Congress approach that? Because it can be demoralizing. We just published a piece today from a prospective Vanderbilt psychiatrist who doesn't want to come here now because of the environment in the legislative environment.
Tennessee was always a border state dating back to the Civil War, but now we have chosen to become a deep South state. That is a tragic mistake because our Republican leadership, for example, in the old days were folks like Howard Baker, Winfield Dunn, Lamar Alexander, Bob Corker, Bill Frist, really noted moderates, particularly Senator Baker. And that tradition in the Republican Party is largely not only lost today, but actively disowned. I know a lot of Republicans extremely well, and they feel so alienated in their own party because almost none of them are Trumpers, and they're kind of appalled by the sort of demagoguery that Trump engaged in. But they're afraid of the public reaction that's been stirred up. And they're afraid, particularly in a Republican primary, to challenge that sort of thinking. So it's really been a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. And the Democrats' mistake has been not to be more welcoming of all the alienated Republicans, because there are tons of them who are proud Republicans, but they just can't do the Trump thing. So we should have been a way station, a halfway house for Republicans who felt like that. And, you know, Democrats can always learn too, because we're so compassionate, we're so idealistic, and that's great. But we also need to learn to pay our bills, you know, practical things like that. And see, Tennessee Democrats have always been like that. Ned McWhorter, you know, Phil Bredesen, great leaders like that, you know. But see, we saw that turn in state politics where Phil Bredesen went from having carried all 95 counties to being unable to carry but, you know, a handful when he ran for the U.S. Senate. So modern media has had a big hand in that, more of the, you know, Fox television and the more extreme versions of that. But it's really degraded public debate, and it's alienated neighbor from neighbor. Because it used to be that people would get along in civic clubs, they discuss things, and there's some pretty heavy-duty issues. But today, people enjoy the sport of long-distance hate. I run into so many people in Nashville who are convinced that they hate Trump or convinced they hate Pelosi or some public figure. And I said, well, what do you know about them? You know, certainly they've never met them, but do they know their kids' names or their spouse names or what they really believe in? And it's so easy to get a misimpression and develop a dislike, when really if you're just calmer about it, you say, well, I might not like that, but this other part's pretty good.
You know, we're recording this on December 9th, and just a few days ago, the Capitol Police were honored by Congress for their heroism on January 6, 2021. And I know it might be painful to come back to that day, because just watching it, I was in Nashville at the time, I'm just watching what I could see from the media, but it was really scary. And as more footage has come out since that time through the committee or through other media sources, what do you remember about that day, and what were your feelings coming out of that?
Well, my wonderful staffer, Lisa Quigley, warned me that something bad was going on, unlike anything we'd seen in 20 or 30 years on the Hill. And it turned out to be the worst attack on the Capitol since the British burned our Capitol in the War of 1812. And this was done by our own citizens, but misguided, misled by the rally they'd just been attending at the White House, and also by all the crazy stuff they saw on social media. But to attack our own Capitol, to physically harm and kill some of our own Capitol Police, to invade and trespass and threaten the safety, certainly of all the senators and probably House members too, although they never got in the House chamber. But one assailant was shot dead by a Capitol policeman who was trying to break into the House chamber. So this is completely lawless and inexcusable behavior. And this was recognized as such that afternoon by folks like Kevin McCarthy, and the next day in interviews. And then a week later, he recanted it all. Like, this is bizarre. Now, Mitch McConnell has stuck much more to his guns in recognizing it was terrible then and terrible now and should never be repeated. But there are a lot of folks who kind of endorse that sort of hell-raising, attitude, when there got to be limits. Free speech we protect, but we do not endorse violence. Certainly not against probably the greatest symbol of hope and freedom that exists in the world. Like, the White House is fine, but it's the Capitol dome that the terrorists were going after on 9/11. The Capitol is the symbol of freedom. It's really the seat of American government. And democracy is messy. Democracy is a sausage-making process, but there's always got to be room for tolerance and understanding and dialogue, and that's not what we saw that day. I personally was barricaded in my office. We didn't know what was going to happen. All the police were disappeared. Most of them were fighting at the barricades, but you had no idea, because the whole Capitol complex was basically taken over by folks who were armed and dangerous and hostile, and you didn't know who they were going after.
What do you direct, for citizens as they start to assess their congressional delegation to come, what are the things that they should be looking for in terms of gauging whether or not their members of Congress are being effective? Because one thing I think that you've prided yourself on is constituent services, which is those quiet things, the ability to get a passport, the ability to understand what is happening. Real ID, you've talked quite a bit about. You had a harrowing experience with Real ID many years ago, and now it's been extended to 2025. So, but what are those things that citizens should say, this member of Congress is effective for me?
Mm-hmm. Well, the bottom line is government should work for regular people. Government should not be against us. Government should be on our side. Now, that starts with constituent services, because so many people run into red tape. These programs are confusing. Oftentimes they need help. And there are ways for a congressional office to help, not just with a passport, but with Social Security, with Medicare, with Medicaid, with lots of government programs that are involved in our daily lives. At the national level, you also need to be a voice for your people. And I'm deeply worried that this is the major problem of Nashville being chopped up. Because in Washington, the Congress is much more likely to hear from rural Tennesseans than from Nashvillians. And that's a real problem, because we're the city with magic. And the rural voices are fine, but we need to learn to respect each other. And that needs to start with the Nashvillians knowing more and caring more and respecting more the people who live outside of Nashville. But likewise, the rural Tennesseans also need to respect Nashville, because we're stronger together. We're better together. And they need to love Nashville, not just for our airport or for our sports arenas or for our shopping or our restaurants, but to just love the culture here, because our inclusivity, our diversity, our energy is fantastic. And that's what makes us a magic city, in addition to the incredible country music talent. And remember, a lot of that talent actually comes from the hinterlands, the most remote rural valleys and mountains, in our region. So together we're better. And this false politics of fighting each other is really ruining the country. So civility, calmness, fairness, being open-minded. So many people are already coming to me and said, well, I can't get a fair hearing from this person or that person. Well, I hope they will open their ears and open their hearts to what Tennesseans really feel, because we live in a representative democracy. It's a republic, and we need to respond to what regular people want.
Thank you so much. And you have run for office many times. You've run for the House, you've run for the Senate. And what are some of the lessons in terms of both the victories and losses that you've learned from, and what are the things that carry with you?
I will be eternally grateful to Tennessee voters, because they have given me a 33-1 win-loss record. I've only lost one race out of 34 races. So Tennessee voters are amazingly fair-minded, good people, but you have to respect them. Never talk down to them. Never overlook their priorities. Never assume that, they don't matter. They do matter, both as a large group of voters and as individuals. And you don't have to be fancy to be important. You just have to be from Tennessee. And that means my job is to represent you. So politics is way simpler than people think. You can make it real complicated if you want, but it's mainly about being nice to people. Tip O'Neill used to say, it's nice to be important, but it's way more important to be nice. And that shouldn't be hard, because basic graciousness, hospitality should be elemental in all Tennesseans. That means listening. I don't talk a whole lot. Too many of my colleagues love to spout off on all subjects, and if you do talk, you should know what you're talking about. That's always a good thing. And so often, like especially for a quick media interview, you don't have to know much. You just have to do the talking points. And so many people are so good at that today, but it's about a mile wide and an inch deep. You want to know that it's grounded in fundamental American values, fundamental religious values, fundamental community values. You see, that sort of mutual respect is really just the golden rule, which is the foundation of every religion. Treat others as you would like to be treated. That shouldn't be hard. And once that's communicated in an election, people are more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt, which is the greatest gift that anyone can give anyone else, the benefit of the doubt.
Now, you've been involved in two extremely consequential votes on impeachment. I remember we talked a few years ago, and that was something that was, that has often been misused as a tool. We saw it in the 90s, but this was different, I think, for you. Could you tell us a little bit about why your vote mattered, and why the yes vote mattered?
Well, I think everyone realizes there need to be guardrails in any family, in any business, in any government. And when people deliberately violate those guardrails, that really makes it hard on everyone. Because our founders were brilliant people, but they assumed, probably wrongly today, that everyone involved in government would be a gentleman or gentlewoman. And that's no longer true. There are thugs in life. And sometimes you see this in movies with mafia people, or, but that can destroy a community. Those type of people can destroy a government. So, for example, when President Trump chose to talk to Vladimir Putin privately with no one taking notes, having already expressed dangerously pro-Russian positions, and having sought Vladimir Putin's permission to build a skyscraper in Moscow, and having offered Vladimir Putin the suite on top of the building, that is not what you want a U.S. president to be doing. Now, Putin has shown his true colors with the invasion of Ukraine, before that, the invasion of Crimea, Georgia. We don't want our leaders hanging out with folks like Vladimir Putin, especially completely in private, so that not even anyone in the Trump administration knew what they were communicating to each other. Things like that are dangerous. And that shouldn't happen in any open and public democracy. But see, he was able to get away with things like that. And that's not even one of the grounds for impeachment. But it's one of those, to me, deeply troubling things. If you care about Fort Campbell, if you care about our soldiers, if you care about America, we cannot be consorting with dictators and people whose only purpose in life is to destroy America. And you certainly can't not allow that to happen if someone's more interested in the almighty dollar than in the almighty United States. So it's that sort of guardrail that we need around our democracy, which we were lacking, and that meant to me that President Trump could not be trusted. So that was a sign that we needed a change. Vice President Pence would have been fine. I worked with him in the House. He's not my favorite, but he's infinitely better than President Trump.
And you mentioned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Time magazine just named Volodymyr Zelensky the man of the year, the person of the year. Tell us a little bit about your reaction to that and what you think about that.
Well, Ukraine is a curious country. In a way, it's the heartland of Russia. It's where Mother Russia came from. But in a way, it was a stray Soviet ex-republic. They used to have more nuclear weapons than almost any nation on earth, and thank God they got rid of those in the 90s. But it's also been a hopelessly corrupt and kind of tumultuous place. It's had terrible leadership. Oligarchs had taken over the country. But finally, guess what? They elected a comedian to run the country. It's kind of like Steve Carell or somebody, is there, you know. But he actually turned out to have the media skills that were exactly what was needed to rally the soul of the country to fight the Russian invaders. So talent can come in odd places. You know, Winston Churchill was a great British leader, and he had the gift of eloquence that rallied the British people against the Nazis. It turns out that Zelensky, the comedian, knew how to do that because he was serious at heart, because most humor originates in insight. And that can really motivate people. If people feel like they're genuinely understood and listened to. And also, fortunately, our military and our intelligence community had adequately prepared enough of the Ukrainian fighters so that they had the weapons, the man-pads, the NLAWs, things like that, so they could stop 40-mile-long processions of Russian tanks. They'd hit the first one to stop the line, they'd hit the last one so they couldn't retreat, and then they just go down the line. It's astonishingly capable tactics, because the Russians, you know, weren't adequately prepared. And we've seen the hollowness of the Russian army, really the hollowness of any dictatorial army, because they're not fighting for their love of their country. They're fighting because they're drafted and forced to. So it's a real opportunity for the West, and we all need to support the Ukrainians, because they are fighting today for all of us. They are freezing this winter for all of us. And we get so selfish that we worry about gas prices going up, you know, $1 or $2, when really the Ukrainians are barely staying alive this winter. So we should be so thankful for their bravery. You know, it's completely unlike Afghanistan, where they cut and ran, and they could have fended off the Taliban for decades if they'd had any sense at all. But the Ukrainians, with very little, have taken on one of the largest armies in the world, the Russian army, and they are turning them back. They haven't won by any means, and it's still going to be hard. It's going to be a years-long struggle. And I hope that Zelensky will know when to negotiate, because there is no total victory on either side here. But he has turned back one of the worst dictators in the world today. And China, a much more dangerous nation than Russia, is learning this lesson.
As we start getting close to the conclusion, I wanted to ask you about one of my journalists that I admire the most, Maria Ressa. She just won the Nobel Peace Prize not too long ago. She just came out with a book, took on the former Filipino president, Rodrigo Duterte, and has sent out a warning to Americans and the whole world about social media, about authoritarianism, and not asking you to speak directly to her necessarily, but to that message of how do we move forward as a democratic republic at a time when we're seeing the growth of authoritarianism around the world and the acceptance in some corners of our country to accept some sense of authoritarian regime. We just had President Trump talk about ripping up the Constitution.
It's scary, really scary. And Tennesseans are not exempt from this. You know, in the Mueller report, they indicated that way back in 2016, there was a very popular Tennessee website called TN_GOP. It had 100,000 followers, which is enough to swing any election in Tennessee. And all that website was a Russian robot. All that site did was to repeat racist memes. And that was sufficiently appealing to 100,000 Tennesseans so that they followed that site. These forces that we face in modern society, social media, the internet, they're really stronger than we're accustomed to. They're unlike anything that any previous human generation has ever faced. And they can destroy a society, particularly when they're weaponized. It's one thing to have a community chat, that's fine. But when propagandists are there, who are very skilled at understanding what people love or hate, then it can be truly dangerous. 100 years ago, in a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called The Education of Henry Adams wrote that all politics is the systematic organization of hatred. I hope he was wrong, but he could have been right, because hatred motivates you to go to the polls. Hatred motivates you to fight. And we're seeing way too much of that today. We need more civility and calm and debate so that we can achieve solutions that help everyone. It shouldn't be winner take all. It shouldn't be a zero-sum game. It should be solutions that help lift up everyone. And there are ways to do that. John F. Kennedy said it well. He said, a rising tide lifts all the boats, the rowboats and the yachts, and they all need to be lifted up. But instead, we've seen way too much of the trickle-down economics. So if the super rich get even richer, well, then maybe we'll get a little of the benefit. That's not the right way to do things. We need a rising tide that lifts all the boats.
Congressman Jim Cooper, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with me. Any final words of wisdom or any words of for Americans as we move into the future?
Well, I'm grateful for your fine example of civility and for the media presence that you show here. I wish that everyone read the newspaper every day. I felt more comfortable in that world, and so many people today are just getting a little soundbite here, a snippet there. They're enjoying their anger, when what we need is knowledge. We need wisdom. That gives us hope.
Thank you very much. Best of success to you, and look forward to you receiving your book or buying your book when it comes out. I can't wait. Well, what is the topic anyway?
It's actually on the founding of the Space Force.
Okay.
Because we were not protecting our satellites, our precious assets in space. And as the Air Force even said, they built us a glass house, and that's not a safe place to live.
Oh, very good. Well, thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave.